Camera settings. Now, a common thing I see with videographers who are just starting out is they worry way too much about this. In this video, we're going to talk about my favorite picture profiles for Sony and Canon cameras, along with my favorite camera settings. So first, for me, there are only 5 settings you need to worry about. As you get more advanced, you can learn more ways to achieve the look you want by adjusting certain settings more. All you need to worry about are the main 5, which for me are frame rate, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and white balance. First, frame rate. Your camera has the ability to shoot a variety of frames per second, or FPS, which does exactly how it sounds. It determines how many frames per second you are shooting. The standard frame rate that our eyes are used to seeing in Hollywood films is 24 frames per second. So that is the frame rate that we recommend using if you want your videos to look more like cinematic films. However, I shoot everything at 60 frames per second, which means it shoots 60 individual frames per second, which allows me to slow it down to 24 frames per second in post to give me a beautiful and dreamy slow motion look. Because I'm going for that dreamy, romantic, magical look, this is the frame rate that I use and recommend for using for wedding videography. However, there are definitely times when I do use 24 frames per second. I always switch to 24 frames per second when I am filming vows or dance parties, because there's no reason to record people speaking in slow motion. And dance parties are fun and upbeat anyway, so I like them to be at normal speed to match the vibe. So for me, when buying a camera that can shoot 60 frames per second is a must. Most cameras will have this option, but depending on what camera you have will depend on the resolutions available at 60 frames per second. I would recommend shooting no lower than 1080p resolution, as that's the standard in the industry. Older cameras like the Canon 5D Mark III shoot 60 frames per second at 720p, and in my opinion, this is far too low of a resolution for professional wedding videos. So I'd recommend only shooting at 60 frames per second if your camera is capable of doing it at least 1080p. Parker and I both use the 1DX Mark II that can shoot 4K at 60 frames per second. This will take your quality to the next level, but comes with a price, as there aren't many lower end cameras that can shoot 4K at 60. So that having been said, you don't need 4K to shoot weddings. My first year and a half, I filmed weddings on my 5D Mark IV, which can do 1080p at 60, which to me is high quality enough. So unless your clients are asking for it, you don't need 4K. 1080 will be fine, especially since most people view videos from their phones, and it's hard to tell if it was shot in 4K or 1080 anyway. But back to camera settings, second, third, and fourth is shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Let's go over to Parker for a brief explanation of what role your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO all play.
There are 3 numbers that you see on the bottom of your LCD screen. Depending on your camera will depend on which buttons you use to adjust these 3 numbers. So let's take a look at our first number here, which is your shutter speed. Now you'll notice that the higher my shutter speed is, the darker my image gets. This is what the shutter speed looks like at 1 full second and at 1/1000th of a second. Notice how much faster the shutter moves at 1/1000th of a second compared to 1 full second. Because it moves faster, it lets in less light, and this is what darkens your image. But besides just making your image darker or brighter, your shutter speed is affecting your motion blur. So take a look at this video clip shot at 1/30th of a second, and then the same clip shot at 1/1000th of a second. Pay attention to the movement of the lacrosse stick. At 1/30th of a second, there's a lot more motion blur in the image. Now look at the motion blur at 1/1000th of a second. There isn't hardly any motion blur at all. And when I look at individual frames, you see that each still frame is very crisp and sharp. This is what I mean by the shutter speed affecting your motion blur. The higher your shutter speed, the less motion blur you will get. The human eye sees motion blur in real life. So for example, put your hand in front of your face and wave it back and forth, and you'll see that your eye can see motion blur as your fingers cross in front of you. So to replicate the motion blur that is seen by the human eye, the rule of thumb is to always shoot a shutter speed twice your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, then the rule is to have a shutter speed at 1/48th. But since most DSLRs don't have that option, the closest you can get is 1/50th of a second. And likewise, if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you double it to 1/120th of a second shutter speed. Element 2 is your aperture, and just like your shutter speed, when your aperture number is higher, it makes your image darker, and when the number is lower, it makes the image brighter. So this lens I have on right now opens up to an f-stop of 1.4 to let in the most amount of light, and closes down to an f-stop of 22 to let in the least amount of light. Basically, the bigger the opening and lower the number, the more light it lets in. But more than just letting in more or less light into your image, your aperture is affecting your depth of field. Depth of field refers to the amount of background blur your image has. So at a low aperture like 2.8, it creates what's called a shallow depth of field, or a small range of focus. and the rest will be blurred out. Here's the same shot at a high aperture. You'll see that there's a much greater depth of field, or more of your image is in focus. I personally try to keep my aperture on the lower end when I'm shooting people or any subject that I want the viewer to be focused on and not be distracted by anything in the background. And for situations like wide landscape shots, I'll bring my aperture higher so I can get as much in focus as possible. You have to remember though, that as you raise your shutter speed or aperture higher, it lets in less light, so you'll have to lower the other number to bring in more light to keep your exposure right. And if you are in low light situations or you want to have both your shutter speed and your aperture high, then you'll have to raise your ISO, which is your third element of exposure. But unlike shutter speed and aperture, when you raise your ISO, it makes the image brighter instead of darker. Now, the ISO affects quality of image. Generally, you want the ISO as low as possible for maximum image quality. For example, here's a video shot at 100 ISO, and the same image shot at 6400 ISO. As you can see, the higher the ISO, the noisier and softer the image becomes. Noise refers to all these moving dots of light in your image. Compare the two side by side and you'll see that the lower ISO has a cleaner, sharper image quality, and the higher ISO has a noisier and softer image. So you always want to keep your ISO as low as possible. In summary, these three elements, your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO, work together to determine the exposure of your image.
Now that you understand what each of those are, let's talk about how it applies to your wedding films. First, aperture. I try and use lenses with the lowest possible aperture because I love that shallow depth of field look, or when the subject is so crisp and the background is so blurry. The times I would raise my aperture are for when I'm shooting landscape shots where I want everything to be in focus, or small details, like this shot of the rings. This shot was on an 85mm 1.4 lens, but I was so close that the background was completely blurry. So I raised my aperture to an f-stop of 5.6 in order to show off the gorgeous backdrop. When I shoot landscapes, I like to raise my aperture to an f-stop of about 8 or 12, which lets everything be in focus at the crispest resolution possible. Regardless of what camera you have, I would suggest investing in a lens with a low aperture to make your subjects appear sharper than the background, to help create depth and make your videos look more cinematic. There are great cheap options out there, like the Canon pancake lenses, which have f-stops of 1.8 for only 140 bucks. But the more you spend on a lens, usually the nicer the quality. Next, shutter speed. The rule here is to keep your shutter speed at double your frame rate. The higher your shutter speed, the less motion blur you'll see. But if I'm being completely honest, I don't care. Most people can't tell that much of a difference unless there's a lot of motion, especially if you're slowing the footage down. It's going to be hard for people to tell what shutter speed you shot at, so Parker and I will sometimes jack up our shutter speeds to 1/4000th because we love how crisp every individual frame is, which can be a good thing because if the couple asks for one specific frame from the video that they can have, maybe a moment the photographer missed, you can provide it and it will be sharp because of your high shutter speed. But it can also make your footage look jittery if you have too much motion in the image, so be careful with this if you decide to do it. I'm telling you this because I want you to know the rule, but know that it's okay to break it if you understand the situations where it won't be a big deal, like when there isn't a lot of motion in your image. But generally, keep your shutter speed around twice your frame rate for the best results in the motion blur. In broad daylight with a low aperture and low shutter speed, your image will be way overexposed. So in order to bring the exposure down, I use a 3-stop ND filter, which allows me to keep my aperture wide open, my ISO low, and my shutter speed at around twice my frame rate, all while keeping a clean exposure. The problem that comes up when using ND filters, and the reason why sometimes I don't use them, is that if you are changing from really dark to really bright scenes, the ND filter won't be able to cover that broad of a spectrum and will force you to have to boost your ISO if it gets too dark, making your image noisy. So those are the situations I take off my ND filter, like for the reception for example, as that is usually a lower light scenario. And fourthly, ISO. Like Parker mentioned, the lower your ISO, the crisper your image, and obviously that's what you want. On my Canon 1DX Mark II, the highest ISO that I try to use is 6400. 6400 brightens my image just enough in super low light without losing tons of detail and introducing a lot of noise and grain. But if you're using a camera like the Sony a7 III, you can bump up your ISO to almost 12,800 and you'll see almost zero noise, while the 1DX at that same ISO is very noisy. Perks of Sony, great in low light. If you have lights that you bring to your weddings, which we talk about in another video, then you shouldn't have any problems with too high of an ISO and grainy footage. And lastly, white balance. Every camera has an auto white balance setting, but I don't recommend it. You don't want your camera changing white balance in the middle of a shot because it thought something was a color it wasn't. Learn to use the manual setting. It's easier than you think. Here's a brief explanation by Parker explaining what white balance is and how it affects your image.
Now, white balance is the color balance inside of your camera. It literally means that your camera is trying to offset or balance the color of light that is being cast on your image to make your whites appear white. For example, this shirt that I'm wearing right now is white, but it doesn't look white in this image because I don't have the white balance set correctly in my camera. All light sources have a color temperature that is measured in the units of Kelvin on a scale from 2500 to 10,000. 2500 being very warm red light, like the kind of light you would see from a sunset or that would be given off by indoor light bulbs, and 10,000 being very cool blue light, like the kind of light you would see if you were to point your camera at a perfectly blue sky at midday. And 5600 Kelvin is the temperature of sun at noonday. Now, as clouds start to roll in, that'll change your color temperature to a more blue hue. And at night, by the moonlight, your color temperature is going to be more around 4,000. Now, your sunrises and your sunsets are going to be anywhere from 25 to 3,500, and most indoor light bulbs are going to be around 3,000. So the light that is shining on me right now is coming from my window, which is daylight, so it's 5600 Kelvin. But my camera is set to 2500 Kelvin. So now I'm going to set the camera to 5600 Kelvin to where it should be so that my whites become white. Now my color balance is correctly set at 5600 Kelvin to match the daylight that's coming in through the window. So that's what it means when it's talking about white balance or color temperature. Those all kind of mean the same thing, and it's all about trying to make your whites look white by adjusting the color balance on your camera.
On the 1DX, all I need to do to quickly adjust the white balance is hit the Q button or the WB button at the top and scroll to the white balance. I could then adjust it to a place I like. On Sony cameras, you can hit the function button and quickly maneuver right to the white balance setting. Sometimes you're in a scene where the lights are giving off a bad tint that you don't want. All you need to do is, while you're on the white balance setting on your camera, hit the info button to bring up your color balance grid, or on your Sony camera, just hit the right arrow and then bring your cursor to the opposite of the color you want to get rid of. For example, when I'm filming sparkler exits, the sparklers give off a very warm light, so my Kelvin goes down, but there's still almost a reddish tint, so I pump more green and blue into it to fix it. Knowing how to use these simple settings give you the confidence that you're capturing the best image straight out of camera. Some things just can't be fixed in post. The first week I had my Mark IV, I didn't know these, and I was filming a friend's proposal where my color balance was way off, and it was unfixable, so don't make that mistake. And lastly, picture profiles. For Canon, hit the Q button, maneuver over to the picture profile icon, select one of the custom profiles, and adjust it accordingly. You can play around with your camera to see what your style is, but for me, here's what I've done. Canon's sharpness is a little too intense for me, so I lower that to +1. Contrast is at -2, saturation at -2, and color tone at 0. Parker has a slightly different look for his wedding videos, which is less moody and more vibrant with more in-camera colors, resulting in less color grading in post. And here's a look at his picture profile. Sharpness set to 0, contrast at -1, saturation at 0, and color tone at 0. Not super different, but there you go. Play around with these settings for yourself to find out what settings you like best. As for Sony, Parker will walk us through our custom picture profile that we created to match Canon colors.
All right, folks, here is the Sony picture profile that I've set to make my colors look like Canon. Come into your settings, into the color white balance section, come down to picture profile, select any of these preset slots, click right, and here's the settings. Black levels +10, gamma still, black gamma, wide range, level -4. Knee, I don't believe we touched this, but it's set to manual mode. And then in manual set, point is at 77.5 and slope is +1. Color mode is ITU 709 matrix, saturation is -9, color phase -7, color depth, I don't believe we changed this, but here's a look at the numbers there, and detail set to -4. And on adjust, I don't believe we touched anything here either, but here's what it looks like. Now you can obviously customize this any way you want. If you want less or more contrast, you can change the black levels. If you want more or less sharpening, you can adjust that in the detail. More or less saturation, you can adjust that. So up to you. That's what I've done to get the results that I've shown you. And lastly, depending on the lighting situation, you may have to pump a little bit of magenta into your image. So with my studio lighting with my Aperture 120D, I came into my white balance and brought my tint down 4 notches, which equals 1 point in magenta. This allowed me to match the skin tones that I would get on my Canon camera. However, outdoors in natural light, I found that this made the image too magenta, so I brought it back to 0. So just be aware that depending on your lighting situation, you may have to add more or less magenta. But that's something I do anyway with my Canon camera as well, depending on the light hues. But there you have it, that is a Sony profile I used to match the skin tones from Canon.
So there you have it, that is it for camera settings. If you can learn how to use these basic settings, you will be ready for just about any situation that's thrown at you. If you guys have any further questions, please let us know.